surprised to hear I'm a department head.
At the reunion, I ran into my high school classmate, Scott, who was just as condescending as ever, sitting back arrogantly as if he still looked down on me. His utter disrespect infuriated me, and although I snapped back, Scott didn't flinch and continued to insult me. As Scott and I heatedly argued, our old friends started to gather around us, drawn by the commotion. Before I knew it, all 50 alumni at the venue had surrounded us. Being ridiculed as the lowest of the low in front of everyone, I retorted repeatedly, growing more irritated. Suddenly, Scott, losing control, shoved me, and I stumbled towards a table set in the center. Just then, a scream-like cry from a woman entered through the entrance. The room's attention turned to the woman, a stunning beauty whose features everyone envied. As the woman approached, Scott suddenly became suspicious and his eyes darted around. After realizing who I was now, Scott looked stunned, as if he couldn't believe it. Of course, Scott's behavior, causing such a disturbance, could not just be overlooked. However, looking back, it was a good opportunity to understand the real feelings Scott had been harboring. My name is Keith Turner. I got married in my 20s and have since led a busy life dominated by work. Before I knew it, I turned 50, an age that makes you reflect on various things. I've been able to live a happy life without any major issues, all thanks to my wife who has always supported me through everything. I make it a point to express my gratitude to her as much as possible. In the hustle of work, the growth of my son also seems to have happened in the blink of an eye. I still thought of my son, Carter, as a little child. However, before I realized it, he had graduated from college and apparently already found a job. Carter's step into the adult world and his continued growth are now what I look forward to. Unlike Carter, who became a working adult after college, I traveled abroad alone right after high school graduation. Not knowing my way around and facing a language barrier, but there was a thrill in facing those dangers back then. Fortunately, the connections I made there led me to my current job. I've never struggled financially, and of course, I enjoy my work. While living such a routine life, I cherish the time spent with my wife and Carter. One holiday morning, lost in sentiment, I peeked into our home's mailbox and found an invitation to a high school reunion. My high school days, the last of my student years, hold many memories, both good and bad. Among various events, one I'd rather not remember involves Scott Wilson. Scott was what you'd call a bad friend. Even though we were considered bad friends, we never got into trouble together or enjoyed doing dangerous things, but I was merely dragged into his reckless antics. Scott always caused trouble and then left me to take the blame while he watched from a safe distance. No matter how many times I refused, Scott forcibly dragged me into these situations, leaving me to deal with the consequences until the bitter end. Eventually, I was the one scolded by parents and teachers. My memories with Scott are only of being dragged into troublesome situations. For me, troubled by Scott's antics, he is someone I would rather not see ever again. Just the thought of encountering Scott and changed after all these years, possibly dragging me into another mess even at the age of 50, was enough to dampen my spirits. Yet, the rare opportunity of a reunion with old friends excited me, and I decided to attend. While eagerly awaiting the day, I prayed that Scott wouldn't be there. On the day of the reunion, wary of Scott, I deliberately dressed plainly and quietly peeked into the venue from the entrance, relieved not to see anyone resembling Scott. Feeling lighter, I was thrilled to see familiar faces and my spirits lifted. While enjoying conversations with old friends, I heard a voice calling my name. The voice, clinging to the back of my mind, stirred unrest within me. Without a doubt, it was discomforting, and turning around, there was Scott, looking at me with the same demeaning gaze as always.
Hey, you're Keith, right? You recognize me, right? Your best buddy, Scott.
Really? It's been a long time. Unlike me, who responded neutrally, Scott talked as if he was looking at a nostalgic toy. I'm just going to grab a drink.
Then, I'll come with you. I'll order your drinks for you.
Even though I tried to naturally distance myself and avoid getting involved as much as possible, Scott persistently stuck to me. Seeing Scott's unchanged inability to read the room, our old friends drifted away, avoiding him. In the end, my wish didn't come true, and I ended up having to deal with Scott.
You only graduated high school, right? I bet at 50, you're not leading much of a life, huh? It's so sad it makes me laugh.
No, it's normal.
It's okay, I know. Look around. Everyone here has that poor look on their face. Unlike me, they must be suffering at the bottom.
All Scott did was spew words that belittled and ridiculed the old friends gathered at the venue. Listening to him was exasperating, but he continued to laugh loudly, pointing at everyone, unfazed by the cold stares directed at him. Suddenly, his gaze turned to my clothes, and he began to insult me as if taking a deep breath.
What's with that outfit? I don't know where you bought it, but it's just oozing with your lowliness.
He mocked my clothes with a broad smile, but on closer inspection, Scott himself wasn't wearing particularly expensive clothes or accessories either. Thinking about what I had to be looked down upon by him made anger well up inside me. But even if I tried to reason with Scott, he would surely keep mocking me without care. Knowing that engaging in such a futile effort would only tire me, I chose to simply ignore his talk. Nodding along nonchalantly as he got carried away, Scott started boasting about his daughter, who I wasn't even asking about.
My daughter is a genius just like me. She joined my company and now she's working with the president.
That's great.
Right. A president is such a distant reality for someone struggling at the bottom like you.
Despite Scott boasting as if he were some elite, the company he worked for seemed fairly average. If his daughter was really acting as something akin to the president's secretary, then she must be competent. However, knowing Scott's reputation as a braggart from the past, I couldn't trust his words, whether they were true or just another boast. Oblivious to my disinterested demeanor, Scott kept talking endlessly. Tired of listening to his elitist bragging that no one else would care to hear, I seized a moment and quietly slipped away. But Scott quickly followed me, sticking to me persistently, even if I went to the restroom. Unable to shake him off, like a line of ducks, I ended up just waiting for the reunion to end. As the drinks flowed and his mood lifted, Scott's boasts about being an indispensable asset to his company intensified.
Unlike you, I'm a valued asset at my company. Without me, the company wouldn't function. It's amazing how much they need me.
His condescending attitude, which mocked me to no end, became unbearable. The pent-up anger from the past resurged, and I couldn't hold back my impulse to finally confront him. Scott, do you have any idea how much trouble you've caused me?
Whatever you do, it's useless. I'm a department head at a well-known company.
His illogical bragging came out of nowhere. Scott claimed to be a department head at a well-known company, but knowing him, giving him power or position has never ended well. If he truly held such a position, His subordinates were probably suffering from his unreasonable demands daily. Feeling sympathy for these unknown employees, I sighed softly. Misinterpreting my hesitation, Scott grew smug.
Surprised I'm a department head.
Being a department head makes you that important.
Don't be bitter. Someone useless like you can only get angry, right?
Scott's relaxed expression irritated me further. Eventually, our argument escalated, heatedly attracting the attention of all 50 classmates who surrounded us.
Don't act so high and mighty. Who do you think you are? I'm the department head of that famous company.
After being furiously pushed by Scott, whose face turned red with anger, I tumbled towards the long table in the center of the venue. The meal we were enjoying scattered on the floor, and my clothes got stained with the splattered food. Despite breathing heavily, Scott, with a look of triumph, continued to look down on me with disdain.
You've always been a slow, good-for-nothing loser. You can't do anything without me, so you should just quietly worship me.
Clutching my arm, hurt from the fall, I glared back at Scott. Some were concerned if I was hurt, while others tried to restrain Scott as he began to rage. The once joyful atmosphere turned into chaos, and Scott kept insulting me relentlessly.
I made you look just like the trash you are. Be grateful for it.
Everyone who heard Scott's remarks was appalled by his brazenness. My anger faded to resignation, and all I could think about was how to leave the scene. Just then, a scream-like cry from a young woman echoed from the entrance of the now silent venue.
Dad, what are you doing?
Dad. The woman who appeared was so strikingly beautiful that everyone had to look twice. However, seeing me and Scott in conflict, she began to tremble, her face contorted with fear.
Keith, is that you?
Addressing me cautiously, she was stared at by a puzzled Scott. Then, in a fluster, she started to apologize.
Keith, I am terribly sorry for my father's disgraceful behavior.
While cringing so much it spoiled her beauty, she kept apologizing to me. But Scott, still confused next to her, ignored her demeanor and started mocking me again.
Hey, Amy, you know this trash. Why are you apologizing so much? It's embarrassing in front of everyone. Just stop.
As Scott tried to pull her up, Amy, the woman, refused to stop apologizing.
I am truly very sorry.
It felt like I had forced a beautiful woman to plead. Feeling unbearable, I tried to console her. I don't know who you are, but please, no more pleading. As she looked up, her stunning beauty was undeniable. Remembering her from a recent meeting, I realized. So, you were the secretary at that company, Amy.
Yes, my name is Amy Wilson. Thank you for being at the meeting with our CEO, David, the other day.
As Amy and I spoke amiably, Scott tilted his head in confusion. Noticing his behavior, Amy sighed deeply and revealed my identity to him.
Dad, don't you remember? I told you about the company that's buying us out because we've been in the red.
What are you talking about?
How can you not remember? You're the department head. Keith is the representative of that company.
Scott stared at me in dumbfounded silence. Understandable given his sudden awkward expression. I had avoided mentioning it, thinking it a hassle, but I had the U.S. branch of an international consulting firm based overseas. The company Scott worked for was indeed in talks to be acquired. The company was a well-known major player, but it had been caught in recent economic troubles, leading to worsening management and a risk of bankruptcy. However, I saw a future for this company and wanted to help it overcome its crisis by bringing it under my wing. While my old friends knew about my work, Scott, who didn't know I was a corporate executive, stood dumbfounded and confused. Seeing him like that, Amy, trying to hold back tears, forcibly made her father Scott apologize.
Come on, Dad, you apologize too.
Why should I apologize to someone like him?
Because without Keith, our company would be gone.
Moved by Amy's repeated apologies, I reassured her that it was fine. Yet, Amy couldn't settle down and kept pressing Scott to apologize to me. Suddenly, Scott looked up, glaring at me as if he wanted to complain. But even Scott, seeing his daughter's panicked state, reluctantly apologized.
I'm sorry.
Amy was furious at Scott's arrogant demeanor, but it seemed Scott himself wasn't convinced.
How can a high school grad like him be better than me? Amy, are you sure you're not mistaken?
Are you still saying that?
I'm a department head, you know. I'm respected at the company.
Perhaps he wanted to show off in front of his daughter. Scott, bragging about being a department head, was met with a deep sigh from Amy, who looked at him disdainfully. Scott, being a department head doesn't mean you're great. It's leading your subordinates that makes you respectable. Even though I tried to explain, Scott looked at me puzzled, not understanding my words. Then, right next to us, Amy, furious, pulled Scott's arm, forcing him to sit on the floor and apologize deeply. Scott resisted, but upon seeing his daughter's tearful, crumpled face, he hesitated and slowly apologized. According to Amy, Scott hadn't always been like this before his promotion. To me, he had always been a troublemaker, but to Amy, he was a kind father. Despite learning of this unexpected side of Scott, I couldn't let an employee like him continue to behave tyrannically in the company we were about to acquire. Scott, we'll need to discuss your future actions with David. Confused, Scott was shocked by Amy's unexpected revelation.
Keith, David was already concerned about this, and we are planning to review the HR soon. A demotion for my father is almost certain.
I'm a department head.
Maybe some people become condescending when they suddenly gain authority. Indeed, back in high school, no one followed leader like Scott without complaints, and I often had to settle disputes because of him. Before his promotion, Scott seemed rather meek and frail. But once he assumed a formal position, he quickly started looking down on others. Throughout history, giving Scott any position or role never leads to anything good. Moreover, his continued outrageous behavior has led to a surge in resignations. They say this is also causing the worsening of employee turnover. Seeing Scott's shocked face as he realized how low he was regarded by the company, he slumped, stunned.
And don't you ever think about how embarrassed I am because of you, Dad? I wish I never joined your company.
Overwhelmed by shock, Scott couldn't hold back and started crying uncontrollably like a child. Instead of worrying about her father's behavior, Amy was berating Scott. Feeling pity for Scott, I calmed Amy down, but she suddenly stood up, gave a brief greeting to me, and then stormed off angrily. Afterward, Scott slowly got up and followed Amy as if trying to catch up with her. Amy is a beauty that anyone would envy, but she seems quite formidable when angered. I thought to myself that any man who marries her is surely in for some tough times ahead as I watched the two of them leave. A week later, the merger process was progressing smoothly, and the company where Scott and Amy worked was saved from bankruptcy. Reflecting on it, Amy's work is flawless, and it's fair to say that my burden is virtually non-existent. Amy, a beautiful and competent woman, is admired by many. Indeed, during a meeting I attended, Amy's reputation as both capable and beautiful was evident, and she even has fans within the company due to her renown. She apparently has a boyfriend, but I can't imagine what kind of person he is. In contrast, although I had heard from Amy, Scott's reputation was quite terrible. His inability to work properly and his undeservedly arrogant attitude caused chaos within his department, making him a troublemaker. At the meeting, the president himself apologized for Scott's overbearing behavior, which took me by surprise. I remember seeing Amy embarrassingly lower her gaze, seeming ready to flee at any moment. Despite being father and daughter, the stark difference in their reputations within the company baffles me. Thanks to Amy, the meeting ended sooner than expected, and I was chatting with the president when suddenly Scott appeared.
Scott, what brings you here all of a sudden?
David, it's not right for me to be demoted from manager, is it? Please say something.
Scott barged into the president's office without knocking, just because he saw me there. He claimed to be a competent employee who contributes to the company, but the distressed president just held his head in his hands. As Scott proudly spoke of his achievements, Amy showed him a personnel evaluation she had prepared. It detailed the numerous complaints about Scott that had been submitted by others within the company.
Keith, I am terribly sorry for the rude behavior of Scott.
Amy apologized on behalf of her father, who was stunned and speechless. Following what the president and Amy suggested, Scott quickly left the president's office. A few days later, the official personnel changes were announced, and as planned, Scott was demoted to an ordinary employee. Furthermore, he was transferred to a subsidiary. Given his bad reputation, he was infamously well known within the company. So perhaps the transfer was for the best. I hoped he would do well at his new location, but I couldn't help feeling a bit worried about what the future might hold for him. Months later, curious about how Scott was doing, I decided to visit the subsidiary where he had been transferred. To my greatest surprise, there was my son, Carter, working with Scott. Carter told me he was on assignment from an affiliated company, but I never imagined he would be working with Scott. Feeling like I had come to a parent's day, I was about to leave quietly without disturbing Carter's work. Just as I was about to reach the exit, I was unexpectedly stopped. Despite my misgivings, I turned around to find Carter rushing towards me, out of breath.
Dad, there's a girl I want you to meet. Can you meet her soon?
Are you getting married?
Actually, yes.
Blushing slightly, Carter spoke, and I, barely holding back tears of joy, smiled and assured him, of course, before heading home. A few days later, as I headed to the cafe where Carter and his girlfriend were waiting, I couldn't help but feel nervous and unsettled throughout the journey. Despite my wife scolding me for being embarrassed, I was filled with both anticipation and anxiety about what kind of woman Carter would spend his life with. Upon spotting Carter waving from the back of the cafe, I took a seat at the table and was surprised to find a familiar beauty there.
Keith? What are you doing here?
Amy, is it you who Carter is marrying? Carter, looking puzzled, gazed at us as I explained that Amy and I worked together. Realizing this, he burst into laughter, understanding the situation. However, Amy, who hadn't expected such a meeting, looked bewildered but managed a troubled smile. For me, it was unimaginable that Carter would end up with such a beauty. Knowing Amy's fierce temper, I could already envision the challenges Carter might face. It turned out that Carter and Amy had been together for a long time, and my wife already knew about it. What was more surprising was that Scott's wife and my wife were old friends. This series of coincidences felt like something out of a manga or novel, and I was genuinely astounded. During our conversation, the topic naturally turned to Scott. Apparently, Since being demoted, Scott had stopped looking down on others and had become a dependable and kind senior colleague. Hearing such high praise for Scott from Carter took me by surprise. With his daughter Amy and soon-to-be son-in-law Carter by his side, it seemed unlikely that Scott would revert to ridiculing his colleagues as before. If any issues arose, they would likely address them directly, which was reassuring. After becoming in-laws, Scott and Carter unexpectedly got along well in the office, helping each other and enjoying their work together. I heard that the two, having become close, even went out for drinks after work. Carter shared that Scott had felt pressured with its promotion and had struggled with how to interact with others after becoming a manager. At the reunion event, Scott regretted causing me trouble and had vented about it while drunk. Feeling relieved and even happy about his demotion, it seemed that the transfer had been a good fit for him. Being naturally timid and sensitive, Scott's current lifestyle suited him better, and losing his position had ironically given him the capacity to empathize with others. After the personnel changes and Carter's wedding had settled down, I had taken a position as an auditor at the head office. To my surprise, Amy became my secretary. I never imagined I would work with my son's wife. As Carter worked with Scott and our families grew closer, it seemed natural for our wives, who were already good friends. With his reputation improving, there was talk of promoting Scott again, but he declined the position, chuckling that he had had enough of being in charge. Supporting young employees seemed to suit Scott best, perhaps because he had plenty of experience to offer. This decision reminded me of the importance of putting people in roles that fit them best. Hearing directly from Scott about Carter's work was an unexpected joy for me. Having missed many of Carter's school events when he was younger, I was happy to learn about his progress. I had become accustomed to seeing Amy scold Scott, but teaching him about her work pleased him, and he often smiled broadly at me. As we both aged, it was unlikely that we would have shared the joy of our children's growth without these coincidences. Now, for Scott and me, discussing how to play with our grandchildren over drinks had become our greatest delight.